Welcome to Gothic Lore. I'm your host, Silas Vane. Before we begin our journey through the corridors of time, I want you to find a place of absolute comfort. Adjust your pillows, let the weight of your limbs sink into the mattress, and allow the darkness of your room to become a soft, protective cloak. Tonight, we are not merely observers of history, we are travelers returning to our deepest roots. We are going back to a time before the word time had any meaning. Close your eyes now, let the world outside your window fade into a distant hum. Breathe in the cool, still air, and as you exhale, let go of the day's burdens. We are going home. Chapter 1: The Silence and the Spark. Before the stars, before the earth, before the very first heartbeat, there was the void. It is difficult for the human mind to grasp the concept of nothing. We think of empty rooms or the vast stretches of the ocean at night, but even those are filled with air, with water, with the subtle vibrations of existence. But before the beginning, there was a silence so profound it would have swallowed a scream without a ripple. There was no where, for space had not been stretched out. There was no when, for the great clock had not yet begun its first tick. There was only potential, a tension held in the heart of nothingness, like a breath held for an eternity. Then, in a fraction of a second so small that mathematics struggles to name it, the silence broke. This was the Big Bang, though it was not a sound you could have heard. It was an expansion, a sudden, violent flowering of everything from a point smaller than a single grain of shadow. In that first trillionth of a second, the universe was a searing, chaotic brilliance. It was unimaginably hot, billions upon billions of degrees, a furnace of pure energy, where the laws of physics as we know them were still being forged in the heat. Imagine, if you will, the intensity of that moment, all the matter that would ever form the great cathedrals of the world, all the water in the deepest trenches of the Pacific, and every atom in your own body were compressed into a space no larger than the head of a pin. It was a singular point of infinite density. And then it breathed outward. In these earliest moments, the universe was a soup of primordial particles. Quarks and gluons danced in a frantic, high-energy ballet, colliding and merging in the white heat of creation. At this stage, light itself could not travel. The universe was an opaque fog of plasma, so dense and so energetic that photons, the particles of light, were constantly bumping into free electrons, trapped like a wanderer lost in a thick, glowing mist. If you had been there, you would have seen nothing but a blinding, uniform glow in every direction. There was no up, no down, only the relentless expansion of the now. As the seconds turned into minutes, the universe began to do something remarkable. It began to cool. This cooling was the first step toward the complexity we see today. The frantic dancing of the particles slowed down just enough for the first forces of nature to take hold. Gravity, that silent tether that keeps our feet on the ground and the moon in its orbit, began to exert its influence. The strong and weak nuclear forces began to dictate how particles would cling together. Within the first 3 minutes, the temperature dropped enough for protons and neutrons to find one another. They locked together in a process called nucleosynthesis, forming the nuclei of the very first elements, hydrogen and helium. These are the building blocks, the ancient ancestors of all matter. Even now, as you lie there, the hydrogen atoms in the water within your cells are billions of years old, relics of those first 3 minutes of existence. You are carrying pieces of the beginning of time within your very veins. But even after these elements formed, the universe remained dark and shrouded. For nearly 380,000 years, the cosmos was a hot, cooling soup. It was a long, quiet era of transition. The initial violence had passed, and the universe was stretching, growing larger and thinner, like a piece of dark silk being pulled in every direction by invisible hands. Then came the moment of recombination. As the temperature fell below a certain threshold, the free electrons, those little agitators that had been trapping light, were finally captured by the nuclei of hydrogen and helium. They formed the first stable atoms, and in that moment, the fog cleared. Imagine a heavy curtain being pulled back from a window in a dark room. For the first time, light was free to travel across the vastness of space. This first light, the oldest light in existence, still travels through the universe today. We call it the cosmic microwave background radiation, the fading afterglow of the Big Bang. It is a ghostly map of the infant universe, a whisper from the deep past that we can still detect with our most sensitive instruments. It is the first photograph ever taken of the cosmos, showing a landscape of subtle ripples in density, tiny fluctuations that would eventually grow into the great structures of the heavens. But even with the light free to roam, the universe entered what we call the cosmic dark ages. There were no stars yet. There were no galaxies. There was only a vast, cold, and dark sea of hydrogen and helium gas drifting through an ever-expanding void. It was a time of profound loneliness for the cosmos. For millions of years, the universe was a dark chamber, waiting for the first candle to be lit. Can you feel that stillness, listener? The long, dark ages of the early universe where nothing happened but the slow, patient pull of gravity. It is the same stillness that settles over the world at 3 in the morning when the birds are silent and the wind holds its breath. It was in this darkness that the seeds of everything we love were sown. In the depths of that cold gas, gravity was working in the shadows, drawing atoms together, slowly, inevitably, preparing for the moment the darkness would end. Rest now in that quiet dark. In our next chapter, we shall witness the birth of the first light bringers, the stars. Chapter 2: The First Light Bringers. The universe was a vast, cold ocean of gas, mostly hydrogen, with a dusting of helium, stretching out into an infinity that was still growing. For millions of years there was no light. There were no eyes to see and nothing to be seen. It was the era of the great silence, but gravity, that patient, invisible architect, was never truly still. Even in the absolute dark, it was reaching out, feeling for the slight unevenness in the distribution of gas. It was looking for the ripples we saw in the cosmic background radiation, the tiny clumps, where the matter was just a fraction denser than the space around it. Imagine gravity as a soft, persistent pull, like a magnet hidden beneath a silk sheet. Slowly, Over the course of nearly 200 million years, these clouds of gas began to draw inward. They grew heavier, thicker, and more compressed. As the gas collapsed under its own weight, it began to spin. It began to heat up. The centers of these clouds became pressure cookers of primordial matter. Inside these collapsing cradles, the temperature began to climb from the freezing cold of the void to thousands, then millions of degrees. The atoms of hydrogen, which had been drifting aimlessly for eons, were now being crushed together with such ferocity that they could no longer keep their distance. And then, in a moment that changed the destiny of the cosmos forever, the first star ignited. This was the cosmic dawn. Imagine a single brilliant point of light piercing a darkness that had lasted for 100 million years. It wasn't like the sun we know today. These first stars, the population 3 stars, were monsters of light and heat. They were hundreds of times more massive than our sun, glowing with a fierce blue-white intensity that would have been blinding. They were the giants that ended the Dark Ages, the first candles lit in the cathedral of the night. Because they were so massive, these first stars lived fast and died young. They burned through their nuclear fuel with a desperate hunger. In their cores, a miraculous alchemy was taking place. The extreme pressure and heat were fusing hydrogen into helium, and then helium into heavier elements, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. These are the elements that make up the very fabric of life. Before these stars, the universe was chemically simple. But within the hearts of these firstborn giants, the complexity of the future was being forged. When these stars reached the end of their brief lives, lasting perhaps only a few million years, they did not fade quietly. They ended in spectacular violent explosions called supernovae. These were the greatest fireworks the universe has ever seen. In those final, dying moments, the stars produced even heavier elements, like iron and gold, and blasted them out into the surrounding space. The death of the first stars was actually a gift. They enriched the surrounding gas clouds with these new, heavy materials. They seeded the universe. The next generation of stars would be born from this enriched dust, and they would be smaller, more stable, and more diverse. This cycle of birth, death, and enrichment is the heartbeat of the cosmos. Every atom of gold in a wedding ring, every breath of oxygen in your lungs, and every bit of carbon in your bones was once cooked inside the belly of a dying star. You are, quite literally, made of stardust. As more and more stars ignited, they began to huddle together, drawn by the same gravitational tether. These clusters of stars formed the first protogalaxies, small, ragged collections of light swimming in the dark. Over billions of years, these small groups collided and merged, spiraling around one another like dancers in a slow-motion waltz. Gravity was weaving the stars into the great tapestries we call galaxies. Imagine standing on a lonely planet in one of those early galaxies. The sky would not look like ours. It would be crowded with brilliant blue stars, and the clouds of gas between them would glow with the pinks and purples of new creation. The universe was becoming a garden of light. At the center of these growing galaxies, something even more mysterious was happening. Matter was becoming so dense that it collapsed beyond the point of no return, creating the first supermassive black holes. These invisible titans became the anchors of the galaxies, their immense gravity holding billions of stars in a celestial embrace. Some of these black holes began to feast on the surrounding gas, emitting jets of energy so powerful they could be seen across the entire observable universe. We call these quasars. They were the lighthouses of the ancient deep, signaling that the universe was no longer a void, but a place of incredible power and structure. By the time the universe was 3 billion years old, it had reached its cosmic noon. This was the peak of star formation. The galaxies were brilliant, crowded, and vibrant. It was a time of frantic activity, a golden age of light. But even in this era of abundance, our own home, our sun, and our earth did not yet exist. We were still a dream held in the drifting dust of the Milky Way, waiting for our turn to be born. Can you feel the scale of it? Silas Vane asks you. The vast distances, the immense stretches of time, the slow, rhythmic pulse of stars being born and dying. It is a peaceful rhythm, like the tide, coming in and going out on a midnight shore. The universe is patient. It took billions of years to prepare the stage for us, and it is in no hurry. Let the thought of that deep time settle over you like a heavy, warm blanket. You are part of this ancient story. You are a long-delayed echo of that first cosmic dawn. Sleep now, knowing that the same gravity that built the galaxies is holding you safely in your bed. Chapter 3: The Cradle of the Milky Way. As the eons drifted by, the universe settled into a steady, rhythmic expansion. The frantic, youthful energy of the cosmic noon began to mellow like the golden light of a late afternoon. In this vast, dark gallery, thousands of galaxies were drifting, colliding, and merging. Among them was a growing spiral of light and dust, the Milky Way. At this point, our galaxy was not yet the majestic ordered spiral we see in textbooks today. It was a rugged, hungry collection of star clusters, constantly drawing in smaller neighbor galaxies, absorbing them into its silver-white arms. Imagine the Milky Way as a great, slow-motion whirlpool in a dark sea. Deep within its spiraling currents, generations of stars were living and dying, each one acting as a tiny furnace, refining the raw materials of the cosmos. The oxygen you breathe, the iron in your blood, the silicon in the sand of every beach, all of it was being carefully prepared in the hearts of these ancient, forgotten suns. The universe was patient. It was waiting for the right moment, the right mixture of dust and gas to create something new. Around 5 billion years ago, in a quiet, unremarkable outskirts of the Milky Way's disk, a massive cloud of gas and dust began to stir. This was a molecular cloud, a cold, dark nursery. It was filled with the remnants of those older stars, a rich smoke of carbon, ice, and metal. For a long time it simply drifted, a ghost in the machine of the galaxy, but then perhaps triggered by the shockwave of a distant supernova, or perhaps simply because its own weight became too much to bear, the cloud began to collapse. As the cloud shrank, it began to spin, flattening out into a vast, glowing disk. At the very center, the pressure became immense. The temperature soared, and then a new light flickered into existence. Our sun, Sol, was born. At first, it was a temperamental infant prone to violent outbursts of radiation and solar wind. But as it stabilized, it claimed its place as the anchor of our small corner of the universe. Yet, the sun was not alone. Around it, the leftover scraps of the disk, the dust, and the ice were still swirling in the dark. This was the debris of creation, the crumbs from the sun's table. Gravity began its slow, methodical work once again. Tiny grains of dust bumped into one another, sticking together through static electricity. These clumps grew into pebbles, the pebbles into boulders, and the boulders into planetesimals, mountain-sized rocks hurtling through the dark. This was a violent, chaotic era. The early solar system was a cosmic shooting gallery. Massive rocks collided at incredible speeds, shattering each other or merging to become even larger. Amidst this beautiful destruction, the planets began to take shape. The giants, Jupiter and Saturn, formed further out, where it was cold enough for gases and ices to gather in massive quantities. Closer to the heat of the sun, the rocky planets were forged: Mercury, Venus, Mars, and our own Earth. Early Earth was a vision of Hades. It was a world of molten rock and glowing seas of magma. There were no oceans, no blue skies, no breath of wind, only the relentless heat of a planet still glowing from the friction of its own birth. The surface was a scarred landscape of volcanoes and glowing cracks. It was a world of fire and shadow, an environment that seemed utterly hostile to the very idea of life. And then the most transformative event in our world's history occurred. A wandering planet roughly the size of Mars, which astronomers call Theia, drifted into Earth's path. The collision was cataclysmic. The two worlds did not merely hit, they merged. The impact was so powerful it partially liquefied both planets, sending a massive plume of debris and vaporized rock screaming into orbit around the Earth. Over time, this ring of debris began to clump together, just as the planets had before it. Within a remarkably short period, perhaps only a few decades, this ring coalesced into a silent, silver companion. Our moon was born. In those early days, the moon was much closer to the Earth than it is now. Imagine looking up at a night sky where a gargantuan glowing moon filled half the horizon, its gravity pulling on the molten surface of the Earth with terrifying force. As the Earth began to cool, the heavy metals like iron and nickel sank deep into its center, forming a solid core. This core acted like a giant magnet, creating a protective shield around the planet, the magnetosphere. This invisible armor would eventually protect the world from the sun's harsh breath, allowing an atmosphere to cling to the surface. Slowly the fire began to retreat. The crust hardened. Steam rose from the cooling rocks, thick and heavy, forming the first clouds. For centuries it rained, a relentless global deluge, as the water vapor in the atmosphere finally condensed. This water filled the low basins of the scarred surface, creating the first primitive oceans. These were not the blue, sparkling seas we know today. They were dark, acidic, and heavy with minerals. But they were the cradle. Can you hear the sound of that ancient rain, listener? A steady, rhythmic drumming against the cooling stone, of a brand new world. The violence of the beginning was fading into a long, wet twilight. The earth was settling. It was finding its balance. It was becoming a place where chemistry could finally begin the long, slow transition into biology. Rest your mind on that image, a dark, quiet world of endless rain and stone, waiting for the first spark of life to ignite in the deep. The universe has spent billions of years preparing this room for you. The stars died so that you could have the iron in your blood. The galaxies merged so that your sun could find its home. You are the guest of honor in a house built of stardust. Sleep deeply now. The rain is falling, the world is cooling, and the story is only just beginning. Chapter 4: The Deep Sea Alchemists. Imagine the ocean floor 4 billion years ago. It is a place of absolute darkness, far beneath the reach of any sunlight. The pressure here is immense, enough to crush a modern submarine like a tin can. But along the jagged ridges where the Earth's crust is pulling apart, the planet is breathing. Massive chimneys of rock, some as tall as skyscrapers, rise from the seabed. These are hydrothermal vents, the black smokers and white smokers of the ancient deep. From these chimneys, superheated water rich with minerals and chemicals from the Earth's interior gushes out into the freezing cold of the ocean. It is a violent, swirling mix of sulfur, iron, and hydrogen. To us, it would be a toxic wasteland, but in the tiny, microscopic pores of these rocky chimneys, a delicate dance is beginning. For millions of years, the ocean has been a primordial soup, a collection of simple, carbon-based molecules drifting in the currents. But here, at the vents, there is energy. There is a gradient, a difference in temperature and chemistry between the hot vent water and the cold sea. This gradient acts like a battery, providing the spark needed for simple molecules to lock together into more complex chains. In the quiet, protected nooks of the mineral chimneys, the first building blocks of life, amino acids and nucleotides, are being assembled. They are not alive yet. They are merely sophisticated chemistry. But gravity and electrical attraction are patient. They pull these molecules together, forming long, twisting strands. These strands begin to do something miraculous. They begin to store information. They begin to remember. This is the birth of the first replicators, the ancestors of DNA. They are fragile, flickering things, easily broken by the turbulence of the water, but for every 1,000 that fall apart, one holds together. And that one begins to make copies of itself, using the raw minerals of the vent as its ink and paper. Eventually, these self-replicating strands find a way to wrap themselves in a tiny bubble of fat, a membrane. This is the first cell. It is a tiny, microscopic fortress, a way for life to say, this is me and that is the world. Inside this bubble, the chemistry is controlled. It is protected. It is the very first instance of an individual in the history of the universe. These first organisms, which we call prokaryotes, were incredibly simple. They had no nucleus, no complex machinery. They were little more than tiny bags of chemical instructions. They didn't need oxygen. In fact, oxygen would have been a deadly poison to them. Instead, they ate the chemicals coming from the vents, turning sulfur and hydrogen into the energy they needed to survive. They were the world's first extremists, thriving in a place of fire and pressure. For 1 billion years, a stretch of time so long it defies human imagination, this was the state of the Earth. A lonely, watery world inhabited only by invisible, single-celled ghosts. There were no plants, no fish, no sounds other than the wind and the waves. If you had stood on a shore back then, you would have seen a desolate, alien landscape. The sun would have looked slightly dimmer, and the moon would have been massive in the sky, causing tides so powerful they would have swept miles inland. But life was not content to stay in the dark. Slowly, over countless generations, some of these tiny organisms began to drift away from the vents. They floated toward the surface, toward the light. And there they discovered a new, inexhaustible source of power: the sun. Around 3.5 billion years ago, a group of organisms known as cyanobacteria evolved a way to capture the energy of sunlight, to turn water and carbon dioxide into food. This was the invention of photosynthesis. It was the most important technology ever developed on Earth. But it came with a side effect that would change the world forever. As the cyanobacteria feasted on the light, they released a waste product, a gas that had never existed in large quantities before. This gas was oxygen. At first, the Earth absorbed the oxygen. It turned the iron in the oceans into rust, creating the vast banded iron formations we mine today for our steel. But eventually the oceans couldn't hold any more. The oxygen began to leak into the atmosphere. For the original inhabitants of the Earth, those tiny, sulfur-eating cells, this was a catastrophe. Oxygen was a violent, reactive gas that tore their delicate membranes apart. It was the first great extinction. The world was being poisoned by its own success. But for us and for everything we know, this was the great oxygenation event. The sky began to turn from a murky orange to a brilliant, crystalline blue. An ozone layer began to form high in the atmosphere, shielding the surface from the sun's deadly ultraviolet rays. The stage was being set for a more complex kind of life, one that didn't just survive, but thrived on the very gas that had nearly destroyed the world. As you lie there in the stillness, think about those first tiny cells. They are your ancestors. Every breath of oxygen you take is a gift from those ancient cyanobacteria, drifting in the sunlit waves of 1 billion years ago. Your life is connected by an unbroken chain of copying and breathing, stretching all the way back to a tiny, warm chimney at the bottom of a dark sea. The world is old, and you are a part of its long, slow breathing. Let the rhythm of your own breath match the rhythm of the ancient tides. You are safe. You are part of the story. Chapter 5: The Marriage of Shadows. For eons, life had been limited by its own simplicity. The bacteria and archaea that ruled the world were efficient, but they were small. They were like solo travelers, each carrying only what they could fit in a tiny backpack. They had no way to generate large amounts of energy, and therefore they could never grow complex. They were trapped in a microscopic ceiling. Then, about 2 billion years ago, a singular accidental event occurred. It wasn't a struggle or a hunt, it was an embrace. One larger, single-celled organism, an archaeon, swallowed a smaller bacterium. Normally, this would have been the end of the story. The smaller cell would have been digested and turned into fuel. But this time, something went wrong. Or perhaps, for the first time in history, something went perfectly right. The smaller bacterium survived inside its host, and instead of being a parasite, it began to provide a service. It was remarkably good at processing the new, dangerous oxygen in the water and turning it into pure, high-grade energy. In exchange, the larger host cell provided protection and a steady stream of nutrients. This was endosymbiosis, the birth of the eukaryotic cell. That little guest bacterium eventually evolved into what we now call the mitochondria. They are the powerhouses of your cells, the tiny furnaces that allow you to move, to think, and to dream. Every single cell in your body right now contains the descendants of those ancient, swallowed bacteria. They have their own DNA separate from yours, a living reminder of a peace treaty signed 2 billion years ago in the salt, warm dark of the sea. With this new source of internal power, life could finally afford to get complicated. The eukaryotes developed a nucleus, a central library protected by a velvet soft membrane where the blueprints of life were kept safe. They developed internal skeletons of protein, allowing them to grow larger and change shape. They became the architects of the microscopic world. As these complex cells flourished, they began to experiment with a new way of being: cooperation. For billions of years, every cell had been an island. But now some cells began to realize that there was strength in numbers. They began to cling together after they divided, forming colonies. At first, these were just simple films or clusters, but slowly the cells began to specialize. Some focused on movement, others on sensing the environment, others on digestion. This was the dawn of multicellularity. It was the moment life moved from being a single note to a symphony. Imagine a world where the first animals were little more than living carpets, creatures like Dickinsonia or Charnia. They had no eyes, no mouths, and no skeletons. They were soft, flat, and strange, looking more like quilted mattresses or fern leaves than anything we would recognize today. They lived in a period called the Ediacaran, a twilight world of gentle, slow-moving ghosts. They didn't hunt. They simply absorbed nutrients from the water as they drifted over the sea floor. In this era, the boring billion was finally coming to an end. The Earth was pulsing with a new kind of potential. The oceans were crowded with these soft-bodied pioneers, experimenting with the very idea of having a body. They were the first to feel the touch of the current, the first to sense the difference between light and shadow. But there was a tension building. The world was about to move from a place of quiet grazing to a place of competition. The Garden of Ediacara was a peaceful dream, but nature was preparing to wake up. Deep in the genetic code of these soft creatures, the blueprints for shells, teeth, and eyes were being written. The universe was getting ready to see itself for the very first time. Can you feel the slow, steady pulse of that ancient cooperation within you, listener? As you lie there, billions of your own cells are working in perfect harmony. They are communicating in a language of chemistry and electricity, keeping your heart beating and your lungs expanding without you even having to ask. You are not just one person. You are a vast, thriving city of ancient travelers, all working together to give you this moment of rest. Listen to the rhythm of your breath. It is the same rhythm that guided the first colonies of cells as they learned to live as one. There is a deep, cellular peace in knowing that you are never truly alone. You are a masterpiece of biological teamwork, a legacy of 1 billion years of cooperation. Rest now. Let the soft, Ediacaran ghosts of the past drift through your mind. The world is becoming more complex, but for tonight, you can remain simple. You can just be. The soft, quilted world of the Ediacaran was a long, peaceful dream, but like all dreams, it eventually had to yield to the morning. About 541 million years ago, the pace of the universe seemed to quicken. The quiet grazing of soft-bodied shadows was over. The earth was about to wake up, and it was waking up with a hunger it had never known before. Chapter 6: The Awakening of the Eye. In a geological heartbeat, a mere flash of 20 million years, the oceans transformed. This is what we call the Cambrian explosion. If the previous 4 billion years were a slow, steady climb, this was a leap off a cliff into a sea of infinite variety. For the first time, life developed hard parts. Creatures began to grow shells of calcium, sharp spines, and rigid skeletons. The reason for this was simple and grim. For the first time, life had begun to eat life. Predation had arrived. The Garden of Ediacra was gone, replaced by an arena. And in this arena, a new and terrifying advantage appeared: the eye. Imagine being a creature of the deep, living in a world where sight was nothing more than a vague sense of warmth or shadow. And then, through a series of rapid genetic refinements, you develop a lens. Suddenly, the world isn't just a blur of chemical signals, it is a landscape of shapes, movements, and distances. You can see your prey, you can see your hunter. The universe, for the first time, was looking back at itself. The king of this new, sighted world was Anomalocaris. Picture a nightmare from the deep, a meter-long predator with undulating flaps along its body, 2 large compound eyes on stalks, and a pair of spiked, grasping arms that funneled food into a circular, tooth-lined mouth. It was the world's first apex predator, a titan of the Cambrian seas. To the smaller creatures of the time, Anomalocaris must have been a god of destruction, a shadow moving through the water with lethal intent. But life is resilient. In response to these hunters, the prey evolved armor. This was the era of the trilobites. These were the knights of the ancient ocean, clad in intricate, segmented carapaces of calcite. They scurried across the seafloor in their millions, their many-faceted eyes scanning the water for danger. Some were as small as a button. Others were as large as a dinner plate. They were so successful that they would rule the oceans for nearly 300 million years, far longer than the reign of the dinosaurs or the rise of man. If you could walk along the shore of a Cambrian sea, you would find the beaches empty and silent. No birds cried in the sky, no insects buzzed in the air. The land was still a desert of sun-scorched rock and cooling lava. But just beneath the waves, the water was a riot of color and strange, alien geometry. There were opabinia, creatures with 5 eyes and a long, flexible trunk. There were Waiwaxia, covered in shimmering scales and defensive spikes. Among all this strangeness, however, there was a tiny, shimmering sliver of hope, a small, worm-like creature called Pikaia. It wasn't impressive to look at. It had no shells, no spikes, and no giant claws. But running down the length of its body was a stiff, flexible rod, a notochord. This was the first primitive blueprint for a backbone. Pikaia was our ancestor. In a world of armored giants and multi-eyed monsters, this fragile, swimming ribbon of life held the secret to everything that would follow. Every fish, every reptile, every bird, and every human being is a variation on the theme started by Pikaia. As the Cambrian era progressed, the complexity of life began to weave a web that could never be untangled. The arms race between predator and prey drove evolution to create faster muscles, sharper senses, and more complex brains. The nervous system was becoming a masterpiece of electrical engineering. Life was no longer just surviving. It was experiencing. It was feeling the thrill of the chase and the desperate urge to endure. Can you feel that ancient spark within you, listener? That same nervous system that began in the Cambrian is what allows you to feel the softness of your blankets tonight. The same eyes that first opened in the dark, salty depths, are the ancestors of the eyes you close now as you drift towards sleep. You are the culmination of 500 million years of seeing. The violence of the Cambrian has long since settled into the limestone and shale of the earth. The great Anomalocaris is now nothing more than a fossil, a ghost etched in stone. The world is much quieter now, and you are safe from the ancient hunters of the deep. Let the image of the prehistoric ocean fade into a soft blue mist. The tides are turning, and the first brave pioneers are looking toward the shore. But that is a story for another time. For now, let your thoughts be as light as a Pikaia drifting in the current. You have come a long way. You have survived the explosion of life. You have earned your rest. The oceans were now a theatre of shadows and silver, teeming with the descendants of the Cambrian explosion. But the continents remained empty, vast, silent cathedrals of red rock and grey sand. To the creatures of the deep, the surface was a realm of death, a place of searing radiation and crushing dryness. But the tide was about to turn. Chapter 7: The Silent Shore. For billions of years, the land had been a wasteland. There was no soil, only the pulverized remains of stone, ground down by the relentless rhythm of wind and rain. There was no green, no brown, only the harsh, monochromatic colors of a world without a heartbeat. But about 470 million years ago, during the Ordovician period, a quiet revolution began at the water's edge. It didn't start with a roar or a leap. It started with a carpet of green. The first pioneers were tiny, humble things, mosses and liverworts. They didn't have roots or seeds, they simply clung to the wet rocks near the shore, drinking in the moisture of the spray. They were the first to face the sun without the protection of the water. Slowly, generation by generation, they began to creep inland, following the damp margins of rivers and lakes. As these plants died, their bodies did something the earth had never seen before. They mixed with the crushed rock to create the very first patches of soil. This was the foundation of everything. Soil is a living thing, a graveyard that feeds the future. With soil, more complex plants could take hold. By the Silurian period, the first vascular plants appeared, small, reed-like structures called Cooksonia. They stood only a few centimeters tall, but they were a miracle of engineering. They had internal pipes to carry water upward against the pull of gravity. They were the first towers of the natural world. As the green mantle spread, the silence of the land was finally broken. The first inhabitants of this new world were not the vertebrates, but the arthropods, the ancestors of today's spiders, millipedes, and scorpions. To them, the land was a paradise of untapped resources. There were no predators yet, only an endless buffet of rotting plant matter and moss. They breathed through tiny pores in their sides, skittering across the damp earth in the cool shadows of the first forests. But the most dramatic transformation was still occurring beneath the surface of the coastal lagoons. In the Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes, the competition in the water was becoming fierce. The oceans were ruled by armored giants like Dunkleosteus, a fish with bone-crushing plates for teeth and a body the size of a modern bus. In the crowded, oxygen-poor shallows of the rivers, life was forced to innovate. Imagine a creature called Tiktaalik. It looks like a cross between a fish and an alligator. It has scales and gills, but its head is flat, and its eyes sit on top of its skull, peering out above the waterline like a periscope. Most importantly, Tiktaalik has something revolutionary. Its fins are not just delicate fans of bone. They have sturdy internal structures, the beginnings of wrists and elbows. Can you see it, listener? In the fading light of a Devonian sunset, this pioneer pulls itself onto a muddy bank. It is heavy, and every movement is a struggle against the unfamiliar weight of gravity. It gulps at the air, its primitive lungs burning with the richness of the oxygen. This was the first time a creature with a backbone had ever looked out over the horizon of the land. It was a moment of profound courage, etched into the very marrow of our history. Over millions of years, these fish with legs evolved into the first amphibians. They were the bridge between two worlds. They still needed the water to lay their eggs, but their bodies were changing. Their tails shortened, their limbs grew stronger, and their hearing adapted to the vibrations of the air rather than the water. The land was no longer just a place to visit. It was becoming a home. By 350 million years ago, the Earth entered the Carboniferous period, the age of the great coal forests. The atmosphere was so thick with oxygen that the world became a greenhouse of giants. Ferns and horsetails grew into towering trees, hundreds of feet tall. And in the humid, heavy air of these swampy jungles, the insects grew to terrifying proportions. Dragonflies with the wingspan of hawks soared through the canopy, and millipedes the size of canoes crawled through the undergrowth. This was a world of eternal damp and emerald light. The sound of the wind through the giant club mosses would have been a low, haunting moan. There were no flowers yet, no fruit, and no birdsong. It was a Gothic landscape of moss, shadow, and the heavy scent of decay. But within this green labyrinth, a new kind of life was emerging, a creature that had finally broken the last tie to the water, a creature that could lay its eggs in the dry sand, protected by a leathery shell. The reptiles had arrived, and with them the world was ready to move away from the swamps and into the heart of the continents. As you lie there now, feel the weight of your own body, feel the strength of your bones, the same structures that Tiktaalik first used to pull itself out of the mud. Your breath is the same breath that filled the lungs of the first explorers of the land. You are the heir to a journey that took millions of years, a journey from the dark, silent depths to the sun-drenched surface. The land is quiet now. The giant dragonflies are gone and the ancient coal forests are buried deep beneath your feet, turned into the very energy that powers our world today. You are safe in your nest of blankets. The long climb is over for tonight. Let the stillness of the earth seep into your limbs. You have found your place on the shore. Sleep now in the cradle of the world. The world was green, heavy, and humid, but the clock of the cosmos never stops ticking. As the continents drifted together to form the vast, singular landmass of Pangaea, the lush swamps of the Carboniferous began to dry. The earth became a place of extremes, vast, interior deserts of red sand and mountain ranges that pierced the clouds. Chapter 8: The Great Dying and the Dawn of Kings. The Permian period was a time of strange beauty. The world was dominated by creatures called synapsids, the distant reptilian-looking ancestors of mammals. Among them was the sail-backed Dimetrodon, a predator that basked in the sun of the great desert. Life had found a balance, but beneath the surface of the earth, a fever was building. About 252 million years ago, the earth began to bleed. In a region we now call Siberia, the crust cracked open. This was not a single volcanic eruption, but a pulsing wound in the world that stayed open for nearly 2 million years. Rivers of molten basalt, thousands of miles long, flooded the land. But the lava was not the true killer. The volcanoes released gargantuan amounts of carbon dioxide and methane, triggering a runaway greenhouse effect. The oceans began to warm, losing their oxygen. They became stagnant and toxic, turning a sickly purple as anaerobic bacteria flourished, releasing clouds of hydrogen sulfide gas. The atmosphere became a poison veil. This was the Great Dying, the Permian Triassic extinction. It remains the most catastrophic event in the history of life. Over 95% of all species in the sea and 70% on land vanished. The world became a graveyard of dust and acid rain. Imagine the silence of that world, listener. A planet that had been vibrant and loud was suddenly reduced to a few scattered survivors huddling in the shadows. It was as if the universe had tried to erase the experiment of life entirely. But life is a stubborn ember. Even in the deepest ash, a spark remained. As the fires of the Permian finally cooled, the Triassic period dawned. The world was a blank slate, a quiet, wounded landscape waiting for a new story. And from the survivors of the Great Dying, a new lineage emerged, the archosaurs. These ruling reptiles were built for the new, harsh world. They were faster, more efficient, and more adaptable than anything that had come before. Among these archosaurs were the first dinosaurs. In the beginning, they were not the titans we imagine. They were small, elegant, and bipedal. Imagine a creature like Coelophysis, slim as a greyhound, covered in a light coat of proto-feathers, moving through the ferns with a bird-like grace. They were the underdogs of the Triassic, living in the shadows of giant crocodile-like predators. But the dinosaurs had a secret advantage. Their hips were designed to hold their legs directly under their bodies rather than sprawling to the side like a lizard. This allowed them to breathe easily while they ran. They were the marathon runners of the Mesozoic. When another, smaller extinction event cleared the way at the end of the Triassic, the dinosaurs didn't just survive, they inherited the Earth. The Jurassic period arrived like a long, warm summer. The continents began to pull apart, and the moisture returned to the land. The great deserts were replaced by vast forests of ginkgos, cycads, and towering conifers. And in these forests, the dinosaurs grew to sizes that defy the laws of the imagination. Think of the Brachiosaurus. Imagine a creature so large that its heartbeat was like a drum heard from a mile away. Its neck reached toward the canopy, like a living cathedral spire. As it moved, the very ground beneath your feet would have trembled. These were the largest animals to ever walk the earth, moving in slow, majestic herds through the misty green of the Jurassic morning. This was the era of giants. While the long-necked sauropods grazed the treetops, the first armored tanks like Stegosaurus wandered the glades, their bony plates shimmering in the sun. And in the shadows, the predators grew as well. The Allosaurus, the lion of the Jurassic, moved with a silent, terrifying lethality. Yet, even in this world of monsters, there was a hidden delicacy. High in the branches, the first birds were beginning to take flight, descendants of small, feathered dinosaurs. And scurrying beneath the leaf litter, tiny, furry creatures were hiding. These were the early mammals, our direct ancestors. They were no larger than shrews, living a life of perpetual twilight, waiting for a time when the giants would fall. The Mesozoic was a world of scale and wonder, a 180 million year reign of the most magnificent creatures to ever grace the planet. It was a time when the Earth felt permanent, as if the dinosaurs would rule until the stars burned out. Can you feel the immense weight of that time, listener? The millions of years of heavy footsteps, the rustle of giant leaves, the long, slow shadows of the saurians. It is a world that is gone now, but it is not forgotten. Their bones are the foundations of our hills. Their breath is the carbon that feeds the trees outside your window. Life has survived the fire of the volcanoes and the cold of the deep. It has grown from a tiny spark in the dark sea to a titan that shakes the earth, and you, lying there in the safety of your bed, a part of that same unbroken line. You are a survivor of the great dying. You are the dream of the tiny creatures that hid in the Jurassic shadows. The earth is old and it has seen much sorrow, but it has always returned to the light. Let that thought comfort you. No matter how dark the night, the dawn is an inevitability. Sleep now and dream of the giant forests and the silver moon over a Jurassic sea. You are safe. The giants are gone, but their strength is in your bones. The Jurassic summer transitioned into the long, vibrant afternoon of the Cretaceous. The world was changing once more. The continents continued their slow, tectonic dance, drifting further apart and creating new seaways that cooled the planet and brought rain to once parched interiors. This was perhaps the most beautiful era the Earth had ever known, a world of color, complexity, and the arrival of a new, fragrant wonder. Chapter 9: The Tyrant and the Falling Star. For most of the history of the land, the world was a palette of greens, browns, and greys. But in the early Cretaceous, about 130 million years ago, a revolution of color began. The first flowers, the angiosperms, began to bloom. Imagine the first magnolia-like blossom opening its petals in a valley of ferns. It was a small thing, but it changed everything. With flowers came nectar, and with nectar came the bees, the butterflies, and the specialized insects that wove the web of life even tighter. The world was no longer just a place of scale, it was becoming a place of intricate beauty. In the forests, the dinosaurs had reached the zenith of their evolution. This was the time of the Triceratops, with its grand frill and piercing horns, grazing in great herds across the plains of what is now North America. It was the time of the Ankylosaurus, a living fortress of bone and club. And of course, stalking through the mists of the late Cretaceous was the most famous predator to ever walk the earth, Tyrannosaurus rex. Close your eyes and imagine the presence of the tyrant king. He is not the mindless monster of the movies, but a complex, powerful animal. His skin is a mosaic of scales and perhaps a light mantle of dark feathers along his spine. His vision is sharper than an eagle's, his sense of smell so keen he can track a scent across miles of forest. When he moves, the air itself seems to vibrate with the sheer power of his 6-ton frame. But even this king was part of a delicate balance, a world that felt as though it would last forever. For 66 million years, the dinosaurs had been the undisputed masters of the world. They had seen mountains rise and fall. They had seen the first birds conquer the sky and the first flowers coat the hills. They were successful, diverse, and thriving. But the universe is a place of sudden, indifferent violence. Far out in the darkness of the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, a piece of space debris about 10 kilometers wide had been nudged out of its orbit millions of years prior. It had been tumbling through the void for eons, a silent messenger of doom. On a morning that began like any other in the late Cretaceous, that messenger finally arrived. If you had been there, standing on a beach in what is now the Gulf of Mexico, you would have seen a second sun appear in the sky. It was a point of light so bright, It would have blinded any creature that looked at it. The asteroid struck the shallow sea at the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of 1 billion Hiroshima bombs. In a heartbeat, the world ended. The impact punched a hole through the Earth's crust, vaporizing miles of rock and water instantly. A wall of fire thousands of degrees hot expanded outward, incinerating everything for hundreds of miles. The shockwave flattened entire forests. Tsunami waves, hundreds of meters high, raced across the ocean, swallowing coastlines. But the worst was yet to come. The impact sent billions of tons of soot and sulfur into the upper atmosphere. Within hours, the debris began to fall back to Earth, friction heating the air until the sky itself turned red, like the interior of an oven. Wildfires broke out across every continent, and then, as the soot settled into a thick, black shroud, the sun vanished. The impact winter began. For months, perhaps years, the Earth was plunged into a cold, suffocating darkness. Without sunlight, the plants died. Without plants, the great herbivores starved. And without the herbivores, the predators followed them into the grave. The grand tapestry of the Cretaceous was torn to shreds. The reign of the dinosaurs, which had lasted for nearly 180 million years, was over. But in the cold and the dark, something moved. In the burrows beneath the charred roots of the forests, the tiny mammals, those shrew-like creatures that had lived in the shadows of the giants, were surviving. They were small enough to find food in the rot. They were warm-blooded enough to endure the chill. They were the inheritors of the earth, though they did not know it yet. The silence that followed the impact was profound. The roar of the T-Rex was gone. The trumpeting of the herds was silenced. The earth was a world of ash and shadows once again, much like it had been after the great dying. But the cycle of life is relentless. From the soot, the first ferns began to sprout. From the darkness, the light eventually returned. Can you feel the stillness of that post-impact world, listener? It is a heavy, quiet peace. The giants have passed into legend, their bones settling into the mud to wait for us to find them. The world is reset. The stage is being cleared for a new kind of story, one that leads directly to you. As you lie in your bed, safe from the fires of the past and the cold of the void, remember that you are a descendant of the survivors. You carry the resilience of the creatures that hid in the earth while the stars fell. You are made of the same stardust as the asteroid, and you share the same breath as the kings of old. Sleep now. The world is cooling, the ash is settling, and a new morning is waiting just beyond the horizon. The age of mammals is about to begin. The silence that followed the great impact was a heavy, suffocating blanket. But as the centuries turned into millennia, the black shroud of soot began to wash out of the sky. The sun, once a pale and ghostly disk, regained its golden fire. The earth, scarred and scorched, began to breathe again. This was the dawn of the Cenozoic, the era of new life. And for the first time in nearly 200 million years, the world was empty of giants. Chapter 10: The Age of the Heart. In the wake of the dinosaurs, the world was a jagged, broken place. But life, ever opportunistic, did not wait for the dust to settle completely. The survivors, the small, the burrowing, and the scavengers, emerged into a landscape that was suddenly strangely quiet. Without the towering sauropods to graze the forests or the tyrannosaurs to patrol the plains, the mammals found themselves in a world of infinite potential. At first, they were small. They looked like shrews, like opossums, like hedgehogs, but they possessed two biological gifts that would change the course of history. They were warm-blooded, and they took care of their young. Unlike the reptiles who often left their eggs to the mercy of the elements, these early mammals carried their warmth within them. They nurtured their offspring, feeding them from their own bodies, forming the first bonds of what we might call love. The world was moving from a place of cold scales to a place of soft fur and beating hearts. As the Paleocene transitioned into the Eocene, the Earth became a hothouse once again. Massive tropical forests stretched from the equator all the way to the poles. Palm trees grew in Alaska. Crocodiles swam in the waters of the Arctic. It was a world of emerald light and eternal humidity. In these vast, global jungles, mammals began to explode in diversity. Some went back to the sea, eventually becoming the whales and dolphins. Others took to the air as bats, but our story lies in the canopy. Among the tangled vines and fruit-laden branches, a group of small, nimble creatures began to evolve. These were the early primates like Plesiadapis. They were not yet monkeys, but they were developing the tools of our trade. Their claws were turning into flat nails. Their eyes, once on the sides of their heads like a rabbit's, were moving forward, overlapping to create depth perception. This was a crucial gift. To leap from branch to branch in the high canopy, one must be able to judge the distance of a shadow. They were learning to see the world in 3 dimensions, to see the where as well as the what. For millions of years, our ancestors lived in this green paradise. They developed grasping hands with opposable thumbs, perfect for holding onto a branch or a piece of fruit. They became social, living in groups, communicating with chirps and gestures. The forest was their fortress, a world of safety and abundance. But the earth is a restless traveler. About 34 million years ago, the tectonic plates shifted. Antarctica drifted over the South Pole and became locked in a permanent grip of ice. This triggered a global cooling. The great planet-wide jungles began to retreat toward the equator. In their place, a new kind of landscape appeared, the grasslands. Imagine the confusion of a creature built for the trees when the trees begin to disappear. As the forests of Africa began to fragment, separated by vast stretches of tall, golden grass, our ancestors faced a choice. They could stay in the shrinking patches of forest, or they could do something terrifying. They could go down. Descending from the trees was the most significant move in the history of our lineage. On the ground, the rules were different. In the trees, you could hide. In the grass, you were exposed. To see over the tall stalks, to spot a predator, a saber-toothed cat or a giant hyena moving in the distance, you had to do more than just look. You had to stand. This was the birth of the hominids, About 7 million years ago, a creature like Sahelanthropus or Ardipithecus began to experiment with bipedalism. Standing on two legs was inefficient at first. It was slow and awkward, but it freed the hands. For the first time, a creature could carry food, carry a child, or carry a stone while on the move. The hands, once used for climbing, were now free to become tools of the mind. Can you feel the courage in that transition, listener? The willingness to leave the safety of the heights for the uncertainty of the plains. It is a restlessness that still lives in you. It is the reason you look toward the horizon, the reason you wonder what lies beyond the next hill. You are the descendant of the brave ones who walked into the grass. By 3 million years ago, creatures like Australopithecus afarensis, the famous Lucy, were walking the savannas of Ethiopia. They were small, with brains not much larger than a chimpanzee's, but they were upright. They were travelers. They watched the stars rise over the open plains. Perhaps the first creatures to feel a sense of wonder at the vastness of the night sky. As you lie there now, feel the length of your legs, the structure of your feet. They are built for the long walk, for the journey across the world. Your hands, resting softly on your chest, are the heirs to millions of years of refinement, from grasping branches to crafting the world. The world of the Eocene jungle is gone, turned into the oil and coal that fuels our modern lives. The ancient grasslands have changed, but the heart that began to beat in the shadows of the Cretaceous, the heart that grew warm and nurturing in the Cenozoic, is the same heart beating in your chest tonight. Sleep now. The journey is long and the sun has set on the savannah. You have walked far enough for today. Let the golden grass of the past wave in your dreams. You are home and you are safe. The golden savannah was a place of endless horizon, but the world was growing colder and more unpredictable. The climate began to swing in great, slow cycles, from wet to dry, from warmth to ice. It was a world that demanded more than just physical strength. It demanded a new kind of cunning. It demanded the spark of the mind. Chapter 11. The Architects of the Flame. About 2.5 million years ago, a new character stepped onto the stage of history, Homo habilis, the handyman. While their ancestors had been content to use whatever stone or stick lay at their feet, Homo habilis did something revolutionary. They looked at a rock and saw not just a rock, but the potential for a blade. They were the first to intentionally strike stone against stone, to create a sharp edge. Imagine the sound of that first clack echoing through an ancient valley. It was a small sound, but it was the first note in the symphony of technology. With those primitive stone flakes, our ancestors could access food that no other creature could. The rich, life-giving marrow hidden deep inside the bones of scavenged kills. This boost in protein and fat was like fuel for a growing engine. The brain, that hungry, complex organ, began to swell. By 2 million years ago, Homo erectus had emerged. They were the first of our lineage to look truly like us, tall, slender, and built for the long-distance endurance of the hunt. But their greatest achievement was not their stride. It was their relationship with the most terrifying force in nature: fire. For eons, every living thing on Earth had fled from the smell of smoke. Fire was the consumer, the destroyer. But at some point, in a moment of profound courage or desperate necessity, a group of our ancestors did not run. They reached out, they captured a burning branch from a lightning-struck tree. They fed it, they tamed it. Fire changed everything. It was our first external organ. It did the work of digestion for us, softening tough roots and sterilizing meat, allowing our guts to shrink and our brains to grow even larger. But more importantly, fire gave us the night. Before the flame, the setting of the sun meant the end of all activity, a time of vulnerability and fear in the dark. With the campfire, the night became a sanctuary. Imagine sitting with them, listener, around a fire 1,000,000 years ago. The flames cast long dancing shadows against the cave walls or the surrounding trees. Outside the circle of light, the predators, the saber-toothed cats, and the giant hyenas prowled, their eyes reflecting the orange glow. But they stayed back. For the first time, we were safe in the dark. This circle of light was the cradle of culture. Around the fire, there was nothing to do but look at one another. We began to share stories, at first through gestures and simple grunts, then through the slow, agonizingly beautiful development of language. We began to pass down the how and the why to our children. This was the birth of collective memory. We were no longer starting from scratch with every generation. We were building a cathedral of knowledge, brick by brick. As the eons passed, the genus Homo began to wander. Homo erectus were the first great explorers, leaving Africa and spreading across the vastness of Asia and Europe. They adapted to frozen tundras and steaming jungles. They were the first to prove that the human spirit is not bound by geography, but by imagination. Then, about 300,000 years ago, in the heart of Africa, a new form emerged, Homo sapiens. We were the wise ones. Our brains had reached their modern size, a complex web of billions of neurons capable of abstract thought, of art, and of dreaming. We began to bury our dead with flowers and ochre, signaling the first stirrings of the soul, the realization that there is something beyond the physical world. Deep inside caves like Lascaux or Altamira, our ancestors began to paint. By the flickering light of fat lamps, they drew the bison, the horse, and the lion. These were not just drawings, they were prayers. They were a way of saying, I was here, I saw this, I felt this. They were the first to capture the beauty of the universe and hold it still. As you lie in the comfort of your room, think of that first fire. The warmth you feel beneath your blankets is a distant echo of the warmth that saved our ancestors from the Ice Age. The stillness of your home is the legacy of those who first learned to guard the cave mouth. You are the protagonist of a story that has survived glacial shifts, volcanic winters, and the teeth of the great cats. Your mind, even now as it drifts towards sleep, is the most complex structure in the known universe. It is the result of millions of years of clacks and flickers. You are the dreamer that the first fire starters dreamed of. Listen to the silence. It is not an empty silence, but a full one. Heavy with the history of the walkers, the hunters, and the storytellers. You are safe, You are warm. You are part of the flame that never goes out. Sleep now, and let your mind wander the ancient paths. The morning is far off, and the fire is still burning. The ice was retreating. About 12,000 years ago, the great glaciers that had weighed down the northern continents began to groan and melt, releasing their frozen grip on the earth. The world was warming, the sea levels were rising, and the landscape was shifting once more. For hundreds of thousands of years, we had been the wanderers, the shadows in the grass, the children of the nomad's trail. But as the climate stabilized, a new idea began to take root in the human mind. Chapter 12. The Loom of Time. For a vast eternity of our history, we lived by the rhythm of the seasons and the migration of the herds. We took only what the earth offered, but in the fertile valleys of the Middle East, along the banks of the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, a quiet miracle was occurring. Someone, perhaps a woman gathering wild grains, noticed that where seeds fell, new life grew. This was the birth of agriculture. It was the end of the Great Wander. We began to clear the forests and tilled the soil. We domesticated the wild grasses into wheat and barley. We brought the wild sheep and cattle into our enclosures. This change was more than just a shift in diet, it was a shift in our soul. We became tethered to the land. We built walls of mud, brick, and stone. We built granaries to store the surplus. And with that surplus, for the first time in the history of our species, not everyone had to hunt. Some became builders, some became weavers, some became priests, watching the stars to predict the floods. The first cities, Uruk, Jericho, Çatalhöyük, rose from the dust. They were small, crowded, and loud, but they were the crucibles of civilization. We invented writing, not for poetry at first, but for accounting, to keep track of the grain and the goats. But soon, those clay tablets began to carry the weight of our myths, our laws, and our dreams. Imagine the transition from the campfire to the temple. The light of the fire was now captured in oil lamps of bronze and clay. We built monuments that reached toward the heavens, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the stone circles of Europe. These were our ways of speaking to the eternal, of carving our names into the very bones of the earth, so that time could not erase us. As the centuries bled into millennia, the world became a map of empires. The Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age. We learned to forge the earth's hidden treasures into tools and weapons. We built roads that spanned continents and ships that crossed the wine-dark sea. From the philosophers of Greece to the engineers of Rome, from the poets of China to the mathematicians of India, the human mind was spinning a web of ideas that grew more complex with every passing generation. But even as we built our cathedrals and our palaces, the natural world remained our master. We were still bound by the speed of a horse and the strength of a human arm. Then, only a few hundred years ago, a mere blink in the eye of the universe, the world changed again. We discovered how to unlock the energy of the sun that had been buried for millions of years. We found the ancient coal and the oil, the remnants of those Carboniferous forests and Cretaceous seas. and we set them on fire. The Industrial Revolution arrived like a thundering engine. The silence of the countryside was replaced by the clatter of the loom and the whistle of the steam engine. We built cities of iron and glass. We mastered electricity, turning the night into day with the flick of a switch. We learned to speak across oceans in an instant and to fly through the clouds like the birds of the Jurassic. In this frantic rush of progress, we sometimes forgot where we came from. We looked at the stars and saw not gods but distant suns. We looked at the earth and saw not a mother but a resource. Yet, even in our tallest skyscrapers, the ancient hunter still lives within us. The part of you that feels peace in the presence of a fire, the part of you that stares at the moon with a sense of longing, that is the legacy of the long walk. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, we did the unthinkable. We left. We climbed atop pillars of fire and broke the bonds of gravity. For the first time, we looked back at our home from the silence of the void. We saw the earth for what it truly is, a tiny, fragile, blue marble suspended in a vast, indifferent, dark, a pale blue dot, as the astronomers say. We realized that every star, every galaxy, every dinosaur, and every ancestor we have discussed tonight, everything that ever was, happened on that small, lonely speck of dust. We have come so far, listener, from a spark in a deep-sea vent to a footprint on the moon. We are the universe's way of knowing itself. We are the eyes through which the cosmos gazes at its own reflection. As you lie there in the quiet of the 21st century, feel the immense tapestry of history draped over you. You are the latest stitch in a fabric that began 14 billion years ago. The bed you lie on, the air you breathe, the thoughts you think, they are all part of this magnificent, improbable journey. The world of stone and steel is quiet now. The machines have stilled for the night. You are back in the circle of light, safe and sound. The long journey from the Big Bang to the present moment has led here, to this room, to this breath, to this peace. Rest your weary mind. You are the heir to the stars and the dust. You have nothing left to do tonight but surrender to the tide of sleep. The narrative of the universe is a long and winding path, but every road, no matter how vast, leads eventually to the present moment. We have traveled from the blinding flash of the beginning, through the birth of stars and the collision of worlds to the arrival of the mind. Now, the sun has set on the era of the great migrations and the industrial roar. We find ourselves in the quiet of the now. I am Silas Vane, and this is Gothic Lore. As you drift closer to the shores of sleep, let us contemplate the fragile, beautiful miracle of the world we inhabit today. Chapter 13. The Echo in the Stillness. The world you live in is a marvel of connectivity. We often speak of the modern world as a place of cold glass and flickering screens, but if you look deeper, you will see it is a web of ancient echoes. Every time you turn on a light, you are calling upon the energy of ancient suns, captured by prehistoric ferns and buried for eons. Every time you take a drink of water, you are consuming molecules that may have once been part of a Jurassic sea or the icy tail of a wandering comet. Nothing in this room and nothing in your body is truly new. It is all borrowed from the stars. We live in a time of incredible awareness. For the first time in the history of the Earth, a species, our species, understands its own origin story. We can look at a handful of dirt and see the billion-year struggle of the bacteria that gave us our breath. We can look at the fossils in the cliffside and see the ancestors who survived the fire from the sky. This knowledge is a heavy mantle, but it is also a profound gift. It means we are no longer just passive travelers on this rock. We are the storytellers. We are the consciousness of the cosmos. But as the world has grown louder and faster, we have often lost touch with the silence that birthed us. We are surrounded by the hum of electricity, the distant roar of engines, and the constant flickering light of our devices. Yet at night, when the world settles and the screens go dark, that ancient, primordial stillness returns. It is the same stillness that reigned during the cosmic dark ages. It is the same quiet that settled over the earth after the great extinctions. Can you feel that stillness now, listener? It is not an empty thing. It is a presence. It is the universe holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter. In this modern age, we are more connected to one another than ever before. A thought shared in one corner of the globe can reach the other in the blink of an eye. We are weaving a global mind, a collective memory that spans the entire planet. But we must remember that beneath the digital signals and the satellite orbits, we are still biological creatures. We are still the children of the savannah. Our hearts still beat to the rhythm of the tides, and our minds still seek the safety of the cave and the warmth of the fire. There is a profound loneliness in the modern world, a feeling that we are small and insignificant in the face of such vast complexity. But I want you to remember the journey we have taken together tonight. You are not a stranger in the universe. You are its most intricate creation. Every atom in your left hand was forged in a different star than the atoms in your right hand. You are a collection of stardust that has come together for a brief, brilliant moment to experience what it is like to be alive, to feel the softness of a blanket, to hear the sound of a voice, to dream. The history of the universe is not something that happened out there. It is something that is happening right here, inside you. You are the culmination of 14 billion years of success. You are the survivor of every disaster, the winner of every biological lottery. Every ancestor of yours going back to the first cell in the deep sea vent lived long enough to pass the torch of life to the next. That chain has never been broken, not once, and tonight that torch is in your hands. As you lie there, let the weight of the modern world fall away. The deadlines, the worries, the noise, they are just ripples on the surface of a very deep ocean. Beneath those ripples there is a calm that has existed since the beginning of time. It is the peace of the void, the patience of the mountains, and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the earth. You have reached the end of the long road for tonight. The sun has set, the stars are out, and the world is turning toward the dark. You are safe. You are part of a story that is so vast, so ancient, and so beautiful that it defies words. You are the universe waking up and, for a few hours, deciding to rest. Sleep now, listener. The journey from the stars to your bed is complete. The mists of time are closing around you, soft and protective. Let go of the now and return to the always. You are home. You are stardust. You are loved by the very laws of physics that created you. Good night from Gothic Lore. I am Silas Vane, and I will be here when the stars rise again.